History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3, The Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 8, The Waning of the Classical West. Meanwhile, the army steadily grew bigger. If the barbarians were to be kept out, it had to be paid, fed, and equipped. If the barbarians were not to be kept out, there would be a tribute to pay to them instead. And there was not only the barbarian to contend with. Only in Africa was the imperial frontier reasonably secure against Rome's neighbors, because there were no neighbors there who mattered. In Asia, things were much grimmer. Ever since the days of Sulla, a cold war with Parthia had flared up from time to time into full-scale campaigning. Two things prevented the Romans and Parthians from ever really settling down peacefully. One was the overlapping of their spheres of interest. This was most obvious in Armenia, a kingdom which was alternately a buffer and a shuttlecock between them for a century and a half. But the Parthians also dabbled in the disturbed waters of Jewish unrest, another sensitive matter for Rome. The other factor making for disturbance was the temptation presented to Rome time and time again by Parthia's own internal dynastic troubles. Such facts had already led in the 2nd century AD to intense fighting over Armenia, its details often obscure. Severus eventually penetrated Mesopotamia but had to withdraw. The Mesopotamian valleys were too far away. The Romans were trying to do too much and faced the classic problem of overextended imperialism. But their opponents were tiring and at low ebb, too. Parthian written records are fragmentary, but the tale of exhaustion and growing incompetence emerges from a coinage declining into unintelligibly and blurred derivations from earlier Hellenized designs. In the 3rd century, Parthia disappeared, but the threat to Rome from the east did not. A turning point was reached in the history of the old area of Persian civilization. In about 225 AD, a king called Ardashir killed the last king of Parthia and was crowned in Ctesiphon. He was to recreate the Achaemenid Empire of Persia under a new dynasty, the Sassanids. It would be Rome's greatest antagonist for more than 400 years. There was much continuity here. The Sassanid Empire was Zoroastrian, as Parthia had been, and evoked the Achaemenid tradition as Parthia had done. Within a few years, the Persians had invaded Syria and opened 3 centuries of struggle with the empire. In the 3rd century, there was not a decade without war. The Persians conquered Armenia and took one emperor, Valerian, prisoner. Then they were driven from Armenia and Mesopotamia in 297 AD. This gave the Romans a frontier on the Tigris, but it was not one that they would keep forever. Neither could the Persians keep their conquests. The outcome was a long drawn-out and ding-dong contest. A sort of equilibrium grew up in the 4th and 5th centuries, and only in the 6th did it begin to break down. Meanwhile, commercial ties appeared. Though trade at the frontier was officially limited to 3 designated towns, important colonies of Persian merchants came to live in the great cities of the empire. Persia, moreover, lay across trade routes to India and China, which were as vital to the Roman exporters as to those who wanted Oriental silk, cotton, and spices. Yet these ties did not offset other forces. When not at war, the two empires tended to coexist with cold and cautious hostility. Their relations were complicated by communities and peoples settled on both sides of the frontier, and there was always the danger of the strategic balance being upset by a change in one of the buffer kingdoms, Armenia for instance. The final round of open struggle was put off, but came at last in the 6th century. This is to jump too far ahead for the present. By then, huge changes had taken place in the Roman Empire, which have still to be explained. The conscious dynamism of the Sassanid monarchy was only one of the pressures encouraging them. Another came from the barbarians along the Danube and Rhine frontiers, the origins of folk movements which propelled them forward in the 3rd century and thereafter must be sought in a long development and are less important than the outcome. These peoples grew more insistent, acted in larger groupings, and had in the end to be allowed to settle inside Roman territory. Here, they were first engaged as soldiers to protect the empire against other barbarians and then gradually began to take a hand in running the empire themselves. In 200 AD, this still lay in the future. All that was clear then was that the new pressures were building up. The most important barbarian peoples involved were the Franks and Alemanni on the Rhine and the Goths on the lower Danube. From about 230 AD, the empire was struggling to hold them off, but the cost of fighting on two fronts was heavy. His Persian entanglement soon led one emperor to make concessions to the Alemanni. When his immediate successors added their own quarrels to their Persian burdens, the Goths took advantage of a promising situation and invaded Mysia, the province immediately south of the Danube, killing an emperor there in 251 AD. 5 years later, the Franks crossed the Rhine. The Alemanni followed and got as far as Milan. Gothic armies invaded Greece and raided Asia and the Aegean from the sea. Within a few years, the European dams seemed to give way everywhere at once. The scale of these incursions is not easy to establish. Perhaps the barbarians could never field an army of more than 20 or 30,000. But this too was much at any one place for the imperial army. Its backbone was provided by the recruits from the Illyrian provinces. Appropriately, it was a succession of emperors of Illyrian stock who turned the tide. Much of what they did was simple good soldiering and intelligent extemporization. They recognized priorities. The main dangers lay in Europe and had to be dealt with first. Alliance with Palmyra helped to buy time against Persia. Losses were cut. Trans-Danubian Dacia was abandoned in 270. The army was reorganized to provide effective mobile reserves in each of the main danger areas. This was all the work of Aurelian, whom the Senate significantly called restorer of the Roman Empire. But the cost was heavy. A more fundamental reconstruction was implicit if the work of the Illyrian emperors was to survive, and this was the aim of the Diocletian. A soldier of proven bravery, he sought to restore the Augustan tradition but revolutionized the empire instead. Diocletian had an administrator's genius rather than a soldier's. Without being specially imaginative, he had an excellent grasp of organization and principles, a love of order, and great skill in picking and trusting men to whom he could delegate. He was also energetic. Diocletian's capital was wherever the imperial retinue found itself. It moved about the empire, passing a year here, a couple of months there, and sometimes only a day or two in the same place. The heart of the reforms which emerged from this court was a division of the empire intended to deliver it both from the dangers of internal quarrels between pretenders in remote provinces and from the overextension of its administrative and military resources. In 285 AD, Diocletian appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, with the responsibility for the empire west of a line running from the Danube to Dalmatia. The two Augusti were subsequently each given a Caesar as coadjutor. These were to be both their assistants and successors, thus making possible an orderly transfer of power. In fact, the machine of succession only once operated as Diocletian intended, at his own abdication and that of his colleague, but the practical separation of administration in the two imperial structures was not reversed. After this time, all emperors had to accept a large measure of division even when there was nominally still only one of them. There also now emerged explicitly a new conception of the imperial office. No longer was the title princeps employed. The emperors were the creation of the army, not the Senate, and were deferred to in terms recalling the semi divine kingship of Oriental courts. Practically, they acted through pyramidal bureaucracies. Dioceses, responsible directly to the emperors through their vicars, grouped provinces much smaller and about twice as numerous as the old one had been. The senatorial monopoly of governmental power had long since gone. Senatorial rank now meant in effect merely a social distinction, membership of the wealthy land-owning class, or occupation of one of the important bureaucratic posts. Equestrian rank disappeared. The military establishment of the Tatararchy, as it was called, was much larger and therefore more expensive than that laid down originally by Augustus. The theoretical mobility of the legions, deeply dug into the long occupied garrisons, was abandoned. The army of the frontiers was now broken up into units, some of which remained permanently in the same place, while others provided new mobile forces, smaller than the old legions. Conscription was reintroduced. Something like 500,000 men were under arms. Their direction was wholly separated from the civilian government of the provinces with which it had once been fused. The result of this system do not seem to have been exactly what Diocletian envisaged. They included a considerable measure of military recovery and stabilization, but its cost was enormous. An army whose size doubled in a century had to be paid for by a population which had probably already begun to shrink. Heavy taxation not only compromised the loyalty of the empire's subjects but encouraged corruption. It also required a close control of social arrangements so that the tax base should not be eroded. There was great administrative pressure against social mobility. The peasant, for example, was obliged to stay where he was recorded at the census. Another celebrated, though so far as can be seen totally unsuccessful example was the attempt to regulate wages and prices throughout the empire by a freeze. Such efforts, like those to raise more taxation, meant a bigger civil service, and as the number of administrators increased, so of course did the overheads of the government. In the end, Diocletian probably achieved most by opening the way to a new view of the imperial office itself. The religious aura which is acquired was a response to a real problem. Somehow, under the strain of continued usurpation and failure, the empire had ceased to be unquestioningly accepted. This was not merely because of dislike of higher taxation or fear of its growing numbers of secret police. Its ideological basis had been eroded and it could not focus men's loyalties. A crisis of civilization was going on as well as a crisis of government. The spiritual matrix of the classical world was breaking up. Neither state nor civilization was any longer to be taken for granted, and they needed a new ethos before they could be. An emphasis on the unique status of the emperor and his sacral role was one early response to this need. Consciously, Diocletian acted as a survivor, a Jupiter-like figure holding back chaos. Something in this recalled affinities with those thinkers of the late classical world who saw life as a perpetual struggle of good and evil. Yet this was a vision not Greek or Roman at all, but Oriental. The acceptance of a new vision of the emperor's relation to the gods, and therefore of a new conception of the official cult, did not bode well for the traditional practical tolerance of the Greek world. Decisions about worship might now decide the fate of the empire. These possibilities shaped the history of the Christian churches for both good and ill. In the end, Christianity was to be the legatee of Rome. Many religious sects have risen from the position of persecuted minorities to become establishments in their own right. What sets the Christian church apart is that this took place within the uniquely comprehensive structure of the late Roman Empire, so that it both attached itself to and strengthened the lifeline of classical civilization, with enormous consequences not only for itself but for Europe and ultimately the world. At the beginning of the 3rd century, missionaries had already carried the faith to the non-Jewish people of Asia Minor and North Africa. Particularly in North Africa, Christianity had its first mass successes in the towns. It long remained a predominantly urban phenomenon, but it was still a matter of minorities. Throughout the empire, the old gods and the local deities held the peasants' allegiance. By the year 300, Christians may have made up only about a tenth of the population of the empire, but there had already been striking signs of official favor and even concession. One emperor had been nominally a Christian, and another had included Jesus Christ among the gods honored privately in his household. Such contacts with the court illustrate an interplay of Jewish and classical culture, which is an important part of the story of the process by which Christianity took root in the empire. Perhaps Paul of Tarsus, the Jew who could talk to Athenians in terms they understood, had launched this. Later, early in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, a Palestinian Greek, had striven to show that Christianity had a debt to Greek philosophy. This had a political point. Cultural identification with the classical tradition helped to rebut the charge of disloyalty to the empire. If a Christian could stand in the ideological heritage of the Hellenistic world, he could also be a good citizen, and Justin's rational Christianity, even though he was martyred for it in about 165, envisaged a revelation of the divine reason in which all the great philosophers and prophets had partaken, Plato among them, but which was only complete in Jesus Christ. Others were to follow similar lines, notably the learned Clement of Alexandria, who strove to integrate pagan scholarship with Christianity, and Origen, though his exact teaching is still debated because of the disappearance of many of his writings. A North African Christian, Tertullian, had contemptuously asked what the academy had to do with the church. He was answered by the fathers, who deliberately employed the conceptual armory of Greek philosophy to provide a statement of the faith which anchored Christianity to rationality, as Paul had not done. When coupled to its promise of a salvation after death and the fact that the Christian life could be lived in a purposeful and optimistic way, such developments might lead us to suppose that Christians were, by the 3rd century, confident about the future. In fact, favorable portents were much less striking than the persecutions so prominent in the history of the early church. There were two great outbreaks. That of the middle of the century expressed the spiritual crisis of the establishment. It was not only economic strain and military defeat that were troubling the empire, but a dialectic inherent in Roman success itself. The cosmopolitanism, which had been so much the mark of the empire, was inevitably a solvent of the Romanitas, which was less and less a reality and more a slogan. The Emperor Decius seems to have been convinced that the old recipe of a return to traditional Roman virtue and values could still work. It implied the revival of service to the gods whose benevolence would then be once more deployed in favor of the empire. The Christians, like others, must sacrifice to the Roman tradition, said Decius, and many did, to judge by the certificates issued to save them from persecution. Some did not and died. A few years later, Valerian renewed persecution on the same grounds, though his proconsuls addressed themselves rather to the directing personnel and the property of the church, its buildings and books, than to the mass of the believers. Thereafter, persecution ebbed and the church resumed its shadowy, tolerated existence just below the horizon of official attention. Persecution had shown, nevertheless, that it would require great efforts and prolonged determination to eradicate the new sect. It may even have been already beyond the capacities of Roman government to carry out such an eradication. The exclusiveness and isolation of early Christianity had waned. Christians were increasingly prominent in local affairs in the Asian and African provinces. Bishops were often public figures with whom officials expected to do business. The development of distinct traditions within the faith, those of the Church of Rome, Alexandria, and Carthage being the most important, spoke for the degree to which it was rooted in local society and could express local needs. Outside the empire, too, there had been signs that better times might lie ahead for Christianity. The local rulers of the client states under the shadow of Persia could not afford to neglect any source of local support. Respect for widely held religious views was at least prudent. In Syria, Cilicia, and Cappadocia, Christians had been very successful in their missionary work, and in some towns they formed a social elite. Simple superstition, too, helped to convince the kings. The Christian God might prove powerful, and it could hardly be damaging to insure against his ill wills. Thus, Christianity's political and civic prospects improved. Christians noted with some satisfaction that their persecutors did not prosper. The Goths slew Decius, and Valerian was said to have been skinned alive by the Persians and stuffed. But Diocletian did not appear to draw any conclusions from this, and in 303 launched the last great Roman persecution. It was not at first harsh. The main targets were Christian officials, clergy, and the books and buildings of the church. The books were to be handed over for burning, but for some time there was no death penalty for failing to sacrifice. Many Christians nonetheless did sacrifice, the bishop at Rome among them. Constantius, the Caesar of the West, did not enforce the persecution after 305, when Diocletian abdicated, though his eastern colleague, Diocletian's successor, Galerius, felt strongly about it, ordering a general sacrifice on pain of death. This meant that persecution was worst in Egypt and Asia, where it was kept up a few years longer. But before this, it had been cut across by the complicated politics which led to the emergence of the Emperor Constantine the Great. This was the son of Constantius, who died in Britain in 306, a year after his accession as Augustus. Constantine was there at the time, and although he had not been his father's Caesar, he was hailed as emperor by the army at York. A troubled period of nearly 2 decades followed. Its intricate struggles demonstrated the failure of Diocletian's arrangement for the peaceful transmission of the empire, and only ended in 324 when Constantine reunited the empire under one ruler. But this time he had already addressed himself vigorously and effectively to its problems. though with more success as a soldier than as an administrator. Often with barbarian recruits, he built up a powerful field army distinct from the frontier guards. It was stationed in cities within the empire. This was a strategically sound decision which proved itself in the fighting power the empire showed in the east for the next 2 centuries. Constantine also disbanded the Praetorian Guard and created a new German bodyguard. He restored a stable gold currency and paved the way to the abolition of payments of taxes in the kind and the restoration of a money economy. His fiscal reforms had more mixed results but attempted some readjustment of the weight of taxation so that more should be borne by the rich. None of these things, though, struck contemporaries as much as his attitude to Christianity. Constantine gave the church official house room. He thus played a more important part in shaping its future than any other Christian layman and was to be called the 13th apostle. Yet his personal relationship to Christianity was complicated. He grew up intellectually with the monotheistic predisposition of many late classical men and was in the end undoubtedly convinced believer. It was not then unusual for Christians to do as he did and postpone baptism until their deathbed. But he believed out of fear and hope, for the God he worshipped was a God of power. His first adherence was to the sun god, whose sign he bore and whose cult was already officially associated with that of the emperor. Then in 312, on the eve of the battle, and as a result of what he believed to be a vision, he ordered his soldiers to put on their shields a Christian monogram. This showed a willingness to show suitable respect to whatever gods there might be. He won the battle and thenceforth, though continuing publicly to acknowledge the cult of the sun, he began to show important favors to the Christians and their gods. One manifestation of this was an edict the following year, which was issued by another of the contenders of the empire, after agreement with Constantine at Milan. It restored to Christians their property and granted them the toleration that other religions enjoyed. The justification may be revealed by Constantine's own thinking as well as his wish to arrive at a satisfactory compromise formula with his colleague, for it explained its provisions by the hope that whatever divinity dwells in the heavenly seat may be appeased by and be propitious towards us and to all who are placed under our authority. Constantine went on to make considerable gifts of property to the churches, favoring in particular that of Rome. Besides providing important tax concessions to the clergy, he conferred an unlimited right to receive bequests on the church. Yet for years, his coins continued to honor pagan gods, notably the unconquered sun. Constantine gradually came to see himself as having a quasi-sacerdotal role, and this was of the first importance in the further evolution of the imperial office. He saw himself as responsible to God for the well-being of the church, to which he more and more publicly and unequivocally adhered. After 320, the sun no longer appeared on his coins and soldiers had to attend church parades. But he was always cautious of the susceptibilities of these pagan subjects. Though he later despoiled temples of their gold while building splendid Christian churches and encouraging converts by preferment, he did not cease to tolerate the old cults. In some of Constantine's work, like that of Diocletian, there was the development of things latent and implicit in the past, an extension of earlier precedents. This was true of his interventions in the internal affairs of the church. As early as 272, the Christians of Antioch had appealed to the emperor to remove a bishop, and in 316, Constantine himself tried to settle a controversy in North Africa by installing a bishop of Carthage against the will of a local sectarian group known as Donatists. Constantine came to believe that the emperor owed to God more than a grant of freedom to the church or even an endowment. His conception of his role evolved towards that of a guarantor, if need be, the imposer of the unity which God required as the price of his continuing favor. When he turned on the Donatists, it was this view of his duty which gave them the unhappy distinction of being the first schismatics to be persecuted by a Christian government. Constantine was the creator of Caesaropapism, the belief that the secular ruler has divine authority to settle religious belief, and of the notion of established religion in Europe for the next 1,000 years. Constantine's greatest act in the ordering of religion came just after he had formally declared himself a Christian in 324, a declaration preceded by another victory over an imperial rival who had interestingly been persecuting Christians. This was the calling of the First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Nicaea. It met for the first time in 325, nearly 300 bishops being present, and Constantine presided over it. Its task was to settle the response of the church to a new heresy, Arianism, whose founder, Arius, taught that the Son did not share the divinity of the Father. Though technical and theological, the nice issues to which this gave rise prompted enormous controversy. Grave scandal was alleged by Arius's opponents. Constantine sought to heal the division, and the council laid down a creed which decided against the Arians, but went on in a second reunion to readmit Arius to communion after suitable declarations. That this did not satisfy all the bishops, and that there were few from the West at Nicaea, was less important than that Constantine had presided at this crucial juncture, proclaiming the emperor's enjoyment of special authority and responsibility. The church was clothed in the imperial purple. There were other great implications too. Behind the hair-splitting of the theologians lay a great question of both practice and principle. In the new ideological unity given to the empire by the official establishment of Christianity, what was to be the place of divergent Christian traditions, which were social and political, as well as liturgical and theological realities? The churches of Syria and Egypt, for example, were strongly tinctured by their inheritance of thought and custom, both from the Hellenistic culture and the popular religion of those regions. The importance of such consideration helps to explain why the practical outcome of Constantine's ecclesiastical policy was less than he had hoped. The council did not produce an emollient formula to make easier a general reconciliation in a spirit of compromise. Constantine's own attitude to the Arians soon relaxed. In the end, it was to be an Arian bishop who baptized him as he lay dying. But the opponents of Arius, led by the formidable Athanasius, bishop of Alexandria, were relentless. The quarrel remained unsettled when Arius died, and Constantine's own death followed not long after. Yet, Arianism was not to prosper in the East. Its last successes instead were won by the Arian missionaries to the Germanic tribes of the southeast Russia. Born by these barbarian nations, Arianism was to survive until the 7th century in the West.